The first question is how is Icrom addressing the COVID emergency?
Well, I think the way we are looking at this pandemic is to follow what everybody else is doing. Obviously, our actions are also predetermined by the host country and what all the other international organizations are doing. But as you know, the situation is always changing. But what is important for us is that human life be served. And therefore, we sympathize with everybody who has been affected by the pandemic in terms of health situation. As Icrom, we are also very concerned about our staff, that they remain healthy in this crisis. Obviously, the crisis as it stands, many institutions have been closed or they are working from home. Teleworking has been recommended, but that in itself affects the cultural heritage and cultural institutions. And therefore, as Icrom, we are concerned about that. As the world, I think, is also concerned about the impact of the pandemic on the well-being of people. As we all know, jobs are being lost, things have been closed, and cultural heritage has not been spared. And this is where our concern is. We really need to see how cultural heritage and those who derive life from it can survive this pandemic. But as I said at the beginning, this is a pandemic which is changing on a daily basis. And the most important thing which I want to emphasize is the health of all human beings. Once they are healthy, we can begin to address some of the issues, the economic issues, the cultural issues. There are no economic issues which we can solve in this world without the cultural elements. These are important elements. If we look at the economies of countries, Italy, for example, cultural heritage plays a part. So I think in as much as the pandemic is causing havoc, and in as much as countries are worried about their economies, they should also be worried about the cultural heritage and what we can do, not just to serve cultural heritage, but to make cultural heritage work to find solutions to the pandemic.
Perfect. And what are, from your point of view, the challenges that cultural heritage is facing at the moment? For example, in many closed sites, there is a problem of maintenance and also theft. What do you think about?
I think this is why Icrom has issued a declaration, because we realize that because of prioritizing health issues, which is, again, we are not blaming anybody. It is first and foremost health, which is important for us to be enjoying our cultural heritage. But because of that, because of the pandemic, sites have been abandoned, collections have been abandoned, and nobody is looking after the collections and things like that. We would want to call upon institutions, governments to realize that we cannot neglect these places. They are important for us to look after them, because it is important that we realize the importance of culture in the recovery period. So we call upon all professionals, where it's possible, all institutions, where it's possible, to ensure that we try and preserve our cultural heritage. We try and prevent the theft, the destruction. Again, I want to emphasize, not at the expense of the health of people. Culture is about people. So as Iccrom, we call upon the institutions and governments and other places to ensure that where we can do something about saving cultural heritage, we should do so. And we should do so being mindful of the fact that we will need cultural heritage in order to recover.
Perfect. So how can cultural heritage contribute to the recovery phase after the emergency?
As I've already indicated, that there are various components where cultural heritage will be called upon to play. In some countries, I've already pointed out, Italy, for example, cultural heritage plays a part in the economy of the country. In other places, tourism plays a part in the economy of the country. And therefore, we will need cultural heritage in all its forms to be able to revive tourism, to be able to revive economies. So it's important that we begin to ensure that these things are served. But apart from the economies, the well-being of people, everything about human beings is culture. The art, the dances and plays and so forth, which keep us going, which are contributing to our well-being. Whether we are kids, adults, we need these things to be reenacted as soon as possible so that we begin to go back to, what should I say, normal situation. Even today, the lockdowns are very painful to us because of one thing. We are missing the cultural elements which make our lives much more comfortable. Without these elements, without the theater, without the art, without the cultural elements, we find ourselves in a very difficult situation. So I'm saying that in the recovery period, there is no recovery which is not going to require cultural elements. One of my hopes also is that the COVID pandemic itself is generating some cultural issues, some cultural elements. I have seen the development of what I might call COVID 19 artistic impressions, which are coming up. And I hope, I've already heard that the Nairobi Museum is trying to put up an exhibition, a virtual exhibition, on some of the artistic expressions which people are trying to make themselves well and laugh and all that. So you see, culture, even though COVID has tried to neglect culture, we can't neglect it. It is always present. It is always something which human beings require. It is something which we cannot do away with. So in the recovery, we will need all these things, the cultural assets, the cultural elements. We need our museums to be opened. We need our cathedrals to be opened. We need our monuments, the Colosseum and every other place to be opened so that people can begin to enjoy their lives. So I do not see how this world can recover from this pandemic without cultural heritage. I know everybody is harping on the economy being important. We need to recover economically. I would dare say that without cultural recovery, there's no economy. Without cultural recovery, there are no human beings. And therefore, culture is going to be an important element in whatever recovery things we think of.
Perfect. Then the last question is how the international community can support engagement of national government in efforts after the emergency.
I think what COVID has probably made us realize is that we need each other. It is not just the US or China which is being affected by this disease. It is almost every country. In fact, every country and every human being today knows about the disease, is aware of the disease. It is not going to be solved by one country. And in my view, it is not going to be solved because we have a vaccine. It is going to be solved because the world comes together to say, let's try and solve that. In the same way, I hope the world can also come together to ensure that culture, which is the glue for the world, which is the thing which makes us human beings, we cooperate as one world to ensure that we have emphasized and create our culture, make sure that our culture is part and parcel of this. So there is need for cooperation within the world to ensure that culture is central to all these issues. There is, again, I want to emphasize, there is no society which survives without culture. There is no world without culture. The exchange of cultural things, cultural goods, theaters, visits to sites and all that, this is part of our world. And as we go forward, we call upon the world, the governments, institutions, to come together to make sure that our culture it survives, our culture is propagated, our culture is part of the solution to the pandemic, our culture is part of the solution to reviving the world's economy.